These are 6 tips that the average player will forget in Season 16 of Apex Legends. If you learn to utilize them, then you'll be a step up above your competition. Let's get into it. Tip number 1, utilize selective engagement. This has got to be the most important tip to remember in any battle royale. Who should you fight and why? But even more important is how to fight them. Some players get this idea in their head that just because they saw someone, they need to try to fight them right there, right now. And while I'm certainly not advocating just running away from every fight, I'm saying you want to consider all of the tips that I'm going to list in this video when gauging who to fight and how. Things like, does the enemy have long-range weapons like sniper rifles and your squad doesn't, so you can't really compete with them unless you get up close? Well, in that instance, you don't want to take any free damage from that enemy team and give them what they ultimately want. Instead, focus on closing the gap or just eliminating that team's line of sight for the time being. Maybe they'll be forced to move because of the zone or other factors beyond your control. Another example that's different could be maybe there's a third-party opportunity nearby, but it's going to be in round 2 zone, and the rotation to the next circle is far away. Do you have heat shields? Do you guys have enough meds to make it out? Can this third party be quickly executed, or is there a possibility for it to get drawn out? This could result in your team fighting on 2 different fronts, the oppressive storm damage and the gunfire from another team or teams. This is where tons of mistakes can and will happen. You need to look for the right opportunities and the right timing of who to fight. This is especially true in ranked, but it definitely carries over to public matches, because if you go into a pub and you have one shot and your goal is to win that game, you definitely want to be more selective rather than just trying to fight every single person you see. Now, I'm going to elaborate more on this throughout the video, but I want to get into tip number 2 first. Tip number 2. You must fulfill your role on the squad in Season 16. Now that the legends are split up into different classes, it's even more defined this season on what type of legend you're playing. Now, I know it's still fresh into the season, but people are having to relearn what these classes do. And it's vital to remember what your class is capable of and then play to their strengths and try to avoid their weaknesses. I'll highlight some broad examples here. Let's say you're an assault legend. Well, a little tip would be don't go right for the special assault bins when you're looting. It's better to get looted up first and then hit up that special bin after. These bins spawn something called smart loot. This means they will complement what you already have for weapons. The attachments that will spawn will be based off what you already have. If you hit it first, it could be some random items, or it could just be giving you an attachment or ammo for a gun that you're not planning on keeping. On the other hand though, sometimes the smart loot will give you ammo or attachments that your teammates could use, which I think is cool, but I wish it was 100% for the player who was opening it. A couple times it would spawn ammo for my teammates when I actually needed a different kind of ammo, and they didn't even need the ammo that the bin was giving them. But let's say you're a support legend. You not only get an extra compartment on the blue bins to loot, which should spawn more healing items and survival items like heat shields and mobile res beacons, but you now also have the ability to craft your teammates' banners, even if they've expired. And a lot of people have asked me, is it 30 crafting materials for one banner or for both banners? And the answer is, it's 30 for one, but also 30 for both. So as a support legend, you should always try to be the last one to die in your team. You want to be in the back during fights to aid and assist however you can. You want to be really conscious about the angles that you're taking, and you want to have a really good idea of where you believe your enemies are. Now, that doesn't mean you can't pop off and that you only exist to help your teammates. It's just about finding the right balance as a support player. Let's say you play Loba. Well, you can use your mobility to get out of an unwinnable situation and get to the nearest crafter to respawn your teammates. Loba is actually the only real support legend that has any sort of mobility, besides Newcastle, I guess, but his is much different than Loba's tactical. With that said, it's just really important that you learn to play your life and that you utilize this new feature in the crafters in Season 16. Tip number 3, don't rely too much on hip firing these days. Now, you can obviously still do it, but compared to say a year ago or even 6 months ago, hip firing in Apex is drastically different. They had been slowly altering different weapons' hip fire variations, but none of the changes were anything significant until Season 14, when they fully altered SMG and AR hip fire. They made it so that nearly all SMGs and pistols take a new attachment called laser sights. And just as an example, this basically made it so that if you wanted the previous hip fire accuracy from Season 13 or before on a weapon like, say, the Volt, but you would now need a purple laser sight to get only slightly better hip fire than the normal hip fire from back then. So basically, laser sights are not all that important these days. Now, in Season 16, they nerfed all AR hip fire, and I'm sure you've heard about this. Now, I'm not sure if they applied all of these hip fire nerfs to combat the whole aiming concept that was discovered where you can aim down your sights, then let go and hip fire, and then still get that tighter bullet spread of ADSing. But regardless, hip firing is drastically different. So now that you know all of the context, it's just super important to keep that in mind as you go about trying to hip fire on enemies. It's just way more of a niche tactic now, and the weapon that you have along with its attachments will significantly play a factor in how successful or unsuccessful you are with it. The easiest tip I could give you is if you were hip firing at more of a distant close range, you probably can't get away with that anymore. You will have to ADS or force your way to get really, really close to the enemy so that you have a better chance of killing them with your hip fire. Because most of the weapon's bullet spreads are going very wide, so you need the target to be taking up a good amount of your screen in order for it to be successful. But once again, this will be heavily contingent on what weapon you have and what attachments are on it. Tip number 4, start getting in the mind of your opponent and try predicting what they're going to do. Most players in Apex are very predictable. Being ready for what's to come is of course only half of the battle, but it's an important battle. The second half of the battle is obviously executing your plan on them. Now, if you're not trying to anticipate or predict what your opponent's next probable moves are, then you will most likely be caught off guard, but more importantly, you'll wind up making some crucial mistakes in those moments while you're reacting. Now, of course, when I say this, I'm not saying that every single fight you'll get into, you'll know exactly what your enemies are trying to do. But the better you get at this skill by just practicing it, the more times you'll be right and be ready for what's to come. Remember, a lot of players make mistakes in Apex while they're under pressure. But if you can anticipate what your opponent's next play is, then a lot of that pressure just won't exist. You'll be ready for it. You'll be prepared, and your brain won't be super flustered. Tip number 5, and a lot of you are going to want to listen up here. Stop hot dropping with 7 other teams. I'm sure you've seen your favorite streamer do this, and maybe they're successful in 1 out of 10 games, but their skill is probably 20 times better than the average Apex player. Hot dropping can be beneficial, but you have to try to be strategic about it. What I would recommend is looking around before you drop, see where teams are going. Don't just jump right away because you might screw yourself over. But once you've scoped out where some teams are going and how many teams are left in the dropship, then make a decision based off of that. This can and will apply to the ranked mode too. Remember, each POI on the map will have its uniqueness in how you want to land and contest it. But if you can avoid 50-50ing directly on top of another team, then do so. It's much better to give yourself a greater chance to secure some weapons, heals, and positioning than just chancing it. I mean, actually think about where you're landing, and if you're going to be surrounded and there's no way out because several other teams are surrounding you, well, this will prevent your escape and force your hand to fight multiple waves of opponents. It probably won't end well, at least not in the grand scheme of things. You might get a game 1 out of 5 where it works, but the other 4 you're probably losing. Some people might view this as good practice, and while depending on how much time you're spending playing Apex, it could be. But typically playing with random teammates, this plan will go very poorly. So just think more about where you're landing. I've had much better games with randoms when I go slower as opposed to pedal to the metal. Most of them can't keep up. They're not accustomed to landing with tons of teams. And so I just realized, okay, maybe if we land a little bit more chill, take it slower, I'll actually win or get 7 kills or 5 kills or whatever. And it's just a much better time. If you're playing with a pre-made squad, I still think these tips apply, but you have more discretion there because your whole team is theoretically going to be on the same page. And lastly, tip number 6. Master your surroundings. I'm sure some of you will think this is obvious or that I've said it before, but I really don't care. I've had one too many games where teammates are just clueless to what's going on around them. They might lack situational awareness, enemy awareness, or just flat out not understand specific parts of the map and their positioning in regards to it. One of the main reasons TSM won the ALGS LAN this February was because they did a great job at taking specific fights on terrain that didn't go against them. They carefully assessed their positioning in regards to their enemy's position and never tried to take a fight or be forced to take a fight when their positioning wasn't good. This is probably the most underrated aspect to an FPS game. and more specifically a battle royale game. Everyone gets focused on aim and the settings or sensitivity, but if you just focused on positioning and taking advantage of yours when your enemies have poor positioning, well, you will instantly see results in your games. The really basic principles to start thinking about are things like, where's the nearest cover? Can I get to a building? Can I get to a roof or a balcony? Is there any rocks near me? Who has high ground? Who's abusing a head glitch? Who has low ground? Are there any hills or handrails that can get in the way of this? All of these aspects are key elements that will gauge good or bad positioning, and it's up to you and your teammates to decide when you have that leverage to then utilize it over your opponents. In a recent video, I took a deep dive into all of these things that I discussed in this video, and I applied them to specific fights that I had in game. It may be helpful for you to watch it so you can understand my thought process that I explained over the gameplay. I covered it all in this video here. Check it out next. Thanks for watching. Peace.